everyone. My name is Aman Gurung, and I'm the marketing specialist here at Unlearn. I'm super excited to be sitting down with Diana Alvaro-Cannon, a passionate educator and instructor of our new course, Decolonizing Education, Unlearning, Streaming. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land on which I'm joining you today is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe Haudenosaunee people. I would also like to acknowledge the enduring presence, traditional laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous peoples who we share this land with. Dana, on behalf of Unlearn, I'd like to thank you for the work you have done and continue to do in education. And I'd also like to thank you for the time today to speak with us. For those of us that don't know you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been an educator now for over 20 years, and I've worked in both elementary and secondary panels here in Ontario. And I've held a few different roles as a classroom teacher, a special education teacher, a consultant, and a coordinator. And I'm also a mom of 3 teenagers that are at the foundation of my work and advocacy as an educator.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for telling us a little bit about yourself. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today. Before we dive deep into the importance of destreaming, I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page on what educational streaming is. So for those of us that don't know, could you please tell us a little bit about what streaming is?
Sure. Well, academic streaming, and not to be confused with like TV or podcast streaming, because that sometimes happens, is the way students are separated in schools based on their academic or intellectual abilities. So students are often placed in a stream and typically kept there for most of their academic pathway. And what happens or can happen is that it becomes harmful for several reasons, particularly because students' pathways and opportunities can become hindered if they're placed in a certain pathway.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and helping us get a better idea of what educational streaming is. My personal experience with streaming was not too long ago. It was in high school a few years back. And my goal at that time was to get into university. So I was guided into taking the academic courses, and my friends were also doing the same thing. So I didn't think much of it then. But it wasn't until after I graduated from high school where I took some time to reflect on my experience, where I started questioning, like, well, what if I had been guided to not take academic courses, or if my friend group at that time weren't taking them, where would I be right now? Would I be in university? Or I don't know. This self-reflection really piqued my interest in learning more about destreaming. So now that we know what streaming is, what I want to ask you was, why is destreaming important to you?
Yeah, and your comment or self-reflection is very interesting and common, because many of us that benefited from streaming weren't truly aware of the inequities streaming caused or causes. So those that are privileged do not always see the harm that can be caused. And with that being said, destreaming is important to me because I'm first and foremost a mom, and I want my own children to have opportunities available to them so they can choose a life-fulfilling career they enjoy. And secondly, I have spent most of my career working in the realm of what we call special education. And particularly, I worked with students identified with learning disabilities. And often in school transition meetings and pathways planning for these students, there was a misconception of the students' abilities. So students with learning disabilities have average or above average cognitive abilities, but these students were quickly streamed into pathways that didn't take that into consideration. So they were often quickly labeled through a deficit lens. But I knew these students well, and I knew their capabilities, and so I felt like I was fighting a system that misunderstood students' needs altogether. I also taught grade 8 for many years, and I remember filling out those grade 8 transition to high school recommendation sheets for the high school courses the students would need to take. And I remember as a teacher feeling the burden of deciding an entire child's future while they were only 13 years old. So it's absurd to think that these decisions are being made for kids so young.
Yeah. Looking back, I was also thinking, because I was pretty naive back then, or even if my parents, they could have been told anything, they would have gone with it. It's like, okay, it's just do what the system tells you to do. So thank you for sharing that. I was doing some research on destreaming, and I was surprised to find that Ontario is the only province in Canada that separates students into academic and non-academic streams as early as grade 9. Only recently they've started beginning to end the practice of streaming, starting with grade 9 math in September 2021, with other grade 9 courses to be de-streamed in the upcoming years. So can you speak a little bit on that and the history of streaming and what the current state of streaming is here in Ontario right now?
Yeah, for sure. So there are plenty of research articles and amazing educators that have shared their work and research about the history of streaming. And I reference them in the course. But basically, streaming is rooted in colonialism, where education was basically for the rich and elites. And in post-World War II Ontario, streaming was promoted primarily for the baby boomers to promote jobs in the workforce. And vocational schools were created, but the rates of graduation were very low. And then in the 80s, 3 new streams were created: advanced, general, and basic, which most of my generation grew up with, pretty much all my generation grew up with. Those terms that were used for streaming us in high school. And it pretty much hasn't changed since then. So imagine all these years later, and we still stream in this way. So that's a little bit about the history of streaming. And as Ontario moves forward, we just introduced the new grade 9 de-streamed math for this September 2021. And moving forward, we will be introducing a grade 9 science, de-streamed science, and a grade 9 de-streamed English as well.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Do you know anything about the process as to why it's coming into the system now as opposed to not earlier?
It really comes from the past research over the years that was showing that certain communities of students, their pathways were being blocked. There was just too many barriers to their pathway. And the research has really come to light to show that. So it's been a work in progress. It's just taken this long to finally get to the place where the system is going to start making changes.
Yeah, like you mentioned, one of the main points that you discuss in the course is that a disproportionate amount of students from marginalized groups, such as Black and Indigenous communities, are overrepresented in these applied classes. What are some reasons as to why you think this happens, and what do you think is the long-term impact of this happening in these communities?
This happens because the system was created for the privileged, and there's really no other answer to that. And this just continued. And the long-term impacts are that certain communities did not have access to the same opportunities that others did. So the system created these barriers for the marginalized, but favored the privileged.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
and referring back to the course title is Decolonizing Education, Unlearning Streaming. So we spoke on what streaming is and what de-streaming looks like. So what I wanted to ask you about were the two words decolonizing education. What do those two words mean to you?
So a few things. This course is really a compilation of the research that was helpful in my own understanding the need for destreaming. So it really is my own unlearning and also my own awareness of finally naming and understanding those harmful systemic practices that I and many of us unknowingly contributed to as educators. So I created the course with 5 modules that spoke to me personally as an educator and as a parent. And the modules take the participants through what is streaming, unlearning labels, explaining the data, honoring the power of student voice, and then the hope we have for the future. And it was during the creation of the course and reflecting on the modules that I created or recognized that decolonization was such an apparent theme throughout the course. So I was able to sprinkle in some guiding questions for those taking the course to begin to understand how we are coming to an unraveling of colonized education. And I think that is truly the hope that I have. And I'm still learning and unlearning this too, along with the participants that take the course. So I don't have all the answers, but I do want to empower others to question the system that creates and sustains these oppressions. And we don't want that to happen for future generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, when I was reflecting on the two words of decolonizing education, what was coming into my mind was the word accessibility. Um, it was coming to my mind because I was thinking, how do we make education accessible for all? And that goes for decolonizing anything. How do we make work accessible for all? How do we remove these barriers? So those were the topics that were coming to my head when we were having a discussion of decolonizing education and then when I was going through the course. And speaking on the course, as someone who's had personal experience being in a streaming system, I found the resources within this e-course incredibly helpful to learn more about why de-streaming is an equitable practice. Would you be able to speak more on this e-course and what a participant can expect to learn from this course?
Sure. It takes the participant through the history of streaming, particularly in Ontario, and then helps us uncover why it happened and why it needs to unhappen. And I think helping educators understand that why and why we need to make these changes is really a big piece of the course. So I just really want educators or parents or whoever takes the course, like I said, just to empower them with those questions as to why this needs to happen.
Yeah, thank you for touching on that. One of the statistics I remember you mentioning in the Decolonizing Education Unlearning streaming course was that when compared to students who mainly take academic courses, students who take applied courses are far less likely to graduate high school in general. So I believe the statistic was 93% of TDSB students who take mainly academic courses graduate within 5 years versus only 68.5% for those who take mostly applied courses. And this is a very alarming statistic for me because that's a big percent difference, 68% to 93%. Why do you think this is in terms of the graduation percent? Why do you think it's lower for those that take these applied courses?
There are a number of reasons why, but to dive a bit deeper into it, there often students are placed in the applied courses without understanding the needs of the whole student, and their growth or development is hindered because they're not really encouraged to try different pathways or to be exposed to other avenues or courses that they could take, because when you start in that applied pathway right away, doors are being closed on those students on future courses that they have access to, because you need prerequisites. And so maybe by the time they get to grade 11 or 12, they're realizing they want to do a certain program at a college or university and realize, oh, shoot, I need to go back now and take that grade 10 advanced math, but I didn't take my grade 9. And then they feel kind of hopeless because now they have to go back and redo those courses. So that's an example, just one example of the types of barriers that stop the progression of their learning or stop the progression of their growth.
Yeah, the point you mentioned about doors being closed, I think that's very important, because I was reflecting, like one of my best friends, his neighbor, he's going to high school, and he didn't think he was capable of taking academic courses, and my friend was able to convince him to take those academic courses. But it's this whole conversation of labels and what we think we're capable of in that moment that might change a year down the line, 2 years down the line, where maybe we're a year into high school and we're thinking, no, I actually am capable of this. But if we close that door early on, then we don't have the opportunity to grow. We just set our ceiling right here when our true ceiling might be out there. So it's an important discussion to have for sure.
And I mean, that ceiling is set low at such an early age, 13, 14, 15 years old. And I'm a mother of 3 teenage boys, and I see that. I mean, we're making these decisions for young children at just too early of an age, where there's still so much growth and still so much maturity that needs to happen, and that will happen. And by, early on in grade 8, at those grade 8 transition meetings, we're already determining that child's future and not keeping those doors open. So by having the destream courses in grade 9 and into grade 10, it just creates more opportunities for young students.
For sure. Yeah, like reflecting back on my experiences in high school, I was fortunate enough to have taken those academic courses and did fairly well. And later down the line, I ended up switching my university program, but I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't kept all my opportunities and doors open. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to choose that, hey, maybe I want to switch something, where I thought I was going to be my whole time from grade 9 to 12. I thought I was going to be in a certain program. Then after actually getting to university, I ended up switching. But because I had those prerequisites, I was able to switch. But not everyone has the luxury to do that, because they might not have been guided the same way. So this conversation on having these doors open and making education accessible for all is so important.
It is. And I think you touched upon something when you said decolonization is accessible education. And I love that, because education at the first and foremost should be accessible. And we think, or we assume that it is, but it's not. And this is where the change needs to happen. And it really is about accessible education. And earlier on in the interview, I said I spent a lot of my career in special education, which even just that term, special education, in and of itself is quite archaic. And it really is about accessible education. So, and what makes things accessible and equitable? Well, it really goes back to, you know, keeping those pathways open, having those ramps, having those pieces and bridges so our students can succeed, so our students have opportunities. And streaming really creates those barriers. And just as you mentioned in your example, in terms of you had the prerequisites, so you were lucky, you could just switch the program. A lot of students aren't that fortunate and then think, oh, I got to go back and take those courses. And, you know, as a high school student, you don't really want to do that. It just seems so overwhelming. And another point you had mentioned was about, oh geez, I lost my train of thought, but you had mentioned something. What else? You had mentioned something about a friend of yours. Oh no, it was about the statistic about someone in high school not taking the academic class because they didn't believe they were capable of perhaps taking that course.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they'll jump between academic and applied and see how different the leveling is, and the ceilings of them are different. And what happens is that students often, even if they take an academic class, and I'm pretty certain I referenced this quote in the course, it's often better to get, for example, a 60% in academic math than a 90 in applied math. Because if you stuck with that academic math, and even though you got a lower mark, you had the prerequisite that opened you up to options for many more courses,
Mm-hmm.
even though the grades differed so much. And that's the example of what course selection in terms of streaming causes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. That was one of the statistics that also surprised me. There's a couple of statistics that we mentioned, that you mentioned in that course, and that was one of the ones that hit me a lot. I was like, I didn't know that. I really didn't know that, because if you just look at it from a numbers perspective, it's like, oh, even from a parent perspective, oh, my child can get a 90% applied, but he was getting a 60 in academics. So clearly this will be the better pathway for him or her or whoever. But that's not the case, because it's all about those open doors. It's all about those opportunities, accessibility. So that was very powerful. And the course discusses this more in detail. So I want to thank you again for instructing this course and giving me and a lot of other people the opportunity to learn about this topic.
Awesome. My pleasure.
Yeah. But yeah, just to conclude, Unlearn is very grateful to have had the opportunity to work with you. I'm very grateful to have had this conversation with you, for you to create the Decolonizing Education and Unlearning streaming e-course. For those of you who are currently looking to understand the importance of unlearning streaming to create a more equitable education experience for all, I would highly recommend you enroll in this e-course. It is available at the link below at learn.unlearn.com. Thank you so much, Diana, for your time and contributions in helping us all understand the importance of destreaming. It was a pleasure to speak with you today.
It was a pleasure speaking with you too. Thank you so much.
Yeah.